On an April morning in 2008, Earl Jennings parked his 1978 Chevrolet C20 crooked against the curb outside the Co-op Cafe in Concordia, Kansas, and the tailgate bounced once against the wire that held it shut. The truck had 312,000 miles on the odometer, rust climbing both rocker panels, and a muffler note that sounded like loose bolts in a coffee can. Earl stepped down in boots dark with field mud, overalls with one denim patch stitched over an older corduroy patch, and a faded brown coat lined with feed sack cloth his late mother had sewn in 1974. Two men at the window watched him cross the sidewalk, and one said, not quietly, "Patchwork Earl is here. Maybe he is shopping for parts and prayers." In Cloud and Reno County, people measured seriousness by borrowed horsepower, a new four-wheel drive tractor with a 7-year note, a combine with a climate-controlled cab, and a monthly payment that could buy a small house in town. Operating lines signed in spring with a confident pen stroke, and discussed over pie as though debt itself were proof of ambition. Earl looked like a man one broken gearbox away from selling out. That was appearance. Reality sat 111 miles south in Wichita, where Dana Pike worked from a glass-walled corner office on the 11th floor of Commerce Plaza. Dana handled grain elevators, seed distributors, and one regional feed chain, clients who arrived in polished shoes with polished presentations. Yet when junior staff asked which account she trusted most in a commodity squeeze, she tapped the file box labeled Jennings, Earl, and said, "The best balance sheet in this office belongs to the man who carries mud on his cuffs." Inside that file were land deeds, tax returns, and scanned copies of handwritten ledgers Earl still kept in a seed corn box in his pantry, columns ruled with a carpenter pencil, and totals checked twice. By the time Earl pushed open the cafe door that morning, the nickname had already traveled through elevators, church basements, and auction rows. Patchwork Earl. He nodded, ordered black coffee, and took the end stool. He did not answer jokes with speeches, which made people talk more. He listened. He paid cash for breakfast, $2.40, including tax, and drove back to the farm in a truck most people read as failure. He had learned early that appearance is an expensive language, and he had stopped trying to speak it at 21. In 1971, his father died with 240 acres under cultivation and 3 different notes against machinery, operating inputs, and the house. The total debt was $163,700. Interest rates were still manageable that year, but grain prices softened, and one wet harvest turned projected profit into rollover debt. Earl remembered the kitchen table under a yellow bulb, his mother running numbers on a legal pad, fuel, fertilizer, rent on an extra 80 acres they had taken hoping to spread fixed costs. Then the bank payment dates circled in red. He remembered one sentence from his father, spoken without anger and without self-pity. "Debt eats first." The farm did not collapse overnight. That was the lesson. It thinned. They sold feeder calves, then one pickup, then 40 acres along the creek to meet a principal reduction demand. By February 1973, Earl and his mother kept 120 acres clear and productive, but only because she took a night shift at a nursing home, and he repaired neighbors' sick balers for cash. At 23, he made himself a rule and wrote it at the top of a fresh ledger page. If interest can take it, you do not own it. He did borrow once after that rule, and that mistake hardened it into doctrine. In 1976, he signed a 2-year machinery note for a newer planter package priced at $28,600, convinced by an optimistic yield projection and a lender who said speed would pay for itself. The note carried 9.8% interest and quarterly payments of $4,121. The first year pencil out worked on paper. Then a late freeze clipped stand counts, and a bearing failure during planting forced custom hire work at premium rates. Earl made every payment, but by the final quarter he had sold 11 bred heifers and postponed building repairs to close the note. He stood in the machine shed after the last payment posted and realized he had paid $4,368 in interest for the privilege of sleeping worse. He sold the planter the next spring, bought an older unit for $3,900 cash, and returned to repairs and patience. The arithmetic was always the story because each turning point arrived as numbers with weather attached. March 1980 delivered the public moment that turned private discipline into county folklore. At a Hutchinson equipment lot, dealer Len Mercer stood near a row of new combines in a pressed blue shirt, clean cap with dealership logo, and boots that had never held clay. 6 farmers gathered around while Len pitched a real growth plan to Earl, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. Price, $96,400. Financing, 12.75%. Term, 10 years. Monthly payment, $1,420 before fuel, labor, knives, belts, or inevitable in-season repairs. Len spread the brochure across a hood and tapped the payment line with his finger. Earl looked once, folded the brochure, handed it back, and said 11 words. I grow slower than debt and sleep better than interest rates. Len laughed, not mean for sport, but mean for authority, and told the group, You cannot survive one bad weather cycle without credit. By evening, that prediction had reached 3 towns. 2 weeks later, Earl attended a bankruptcy sale outside Pretty Prairie and bought a repossessed 1972 Combine for $11,800 cash. He hauled it home, split the work over 14 nights, and spent $2,340 on parts, feeder chain $420, belts $280, rasp bars $510, bearing set $196, header auger flighting and patch steel $634, fluids and filters $300. Total in the machine after repair, $14,140. 1 year of Len's proposed payments alone would have been $17,040, and that number did not include interest compounding across a decade. Earl's machine looked old because it was old, but old and paid for still harvest grain. His discipline was not dramatic. It was repetitive. In 1981, corn sold near $3.12 per bushel, and his average yield landed at 109 bushels per acre across 160 owned acres and 120 rented acres. Gross crop revenue came to roughly $95,198 before basis and trucking adjustments. He kept household spending for the year at $14,900, food $4,860, utilities $1,740, fuel for personal vehicles $1,320, clothing $410, property tax and insurance on the house $2,970, health expenses $1,600, church and community giving $900, miscellaneous $1,100, no machinery payment, no revolving consumer debt, no annual vacation financed after harvest. When neighbors upgraded, Earl purchased distress and surplus. In 1982, he bought a 1968 grain drill at auction for $375 and put $220 into opener discs. In 1983, when drought punched yields down and everybody felt fear in their chest, He paid $19,600 cash for 80 acres with poor fencing and a shallow well because the seller needed immediate settlement. He spent another $3,480 on fence repair and pump replacement over 2 seasons, then folded the parcel into his rotation. In 1984, he rebuilt a cracked engine block with a salvaged short block and machine work totaling $1,960, plus his own labor on nights and Sundays. Repair instead of replace. Bid only where cash cleared. Buy one parcel at a time. By the second week of May 1985, people still smirked at his patched overalls when his truck coughed into town, but the same men who laughed also watched him write checks from retained earnings while they waited on lender callbacks. He did not lecture them. He had too much respect for weather and too much memory of his mother at the kitchen table to confuse survival with virtue. Good people were getting squeezed by timing and rates, not moral weakness. Earl simply kept following the rule he had written in carpenter pencil years before, line by line, acre by acre, until the county's favorite joke began to sound less like a joke and more like a misread balance sheet. The next Monday in June 1985, Earl walked into Prairie State, Ag Credit, and Concordia, with mud still drying on his cuffs and a cashier check for $47,700 folded inside a seed invoice envelope. The lobby smelled like fresh carpet glue and lemon cleaner. A frame poster near the teller line showed a new articulated tractor under the words, "Your future, finance today." Len Mercer was already there, leaning against the counter in a pressed white shirt, gold watch visible at the cuff, dealership keys clipped to a leather fob stamped Mercer AG Systems. He glanced at Earl's overalls, then at the wired tailgate visible through the window, and smiled the way people smile when they think they are being generous to a smaller story. The loan officer on duty, Evan Rusk, did not hide his assumption either. He asked Earl whether he was in for an operating renewal packet and began sliding forms across the desk before Earl sat down. Earl did not touch the forms. He slid the cashier check forward and said he wanted immediate settlement papers for the Harlan Quarter. The 70-acre foreclosed tract west of Norway Road that had been listed at $624 per acre, with closing costs estimated at $3,980. Rusk paused, looked again at the check amount, and asked whether Earl understood there would be no financing terms attached because this would be a cash transfer. Earl nodded once. Len watched without speaking. 10 minutes later, Rusk had changed his tone, called the title office, and requested same-week recording. Len left first. His boots were polished enough to reflect the lobby lights. That scene mattered for one reason. In those years, debt had become a social credential in central Kansas, and Earl had just bought another piece of ground with no signatures beyond his own. The man in patched denim had liquidity. The men in starched collars had leverage. They were not the same thing. 3 days later, Earl drove the 1978 C-20 to Wichita to deliver second quarter records to Dana Pike. The truck climbed into downtown traffic with a rattle in the steering column and a windshield crack running from the lower passenger corner to the center. Parking attendants waved him toward surface lots with hourly rates. He chose a metered curb spot 2 blocks away and fed the meter with quarters from a tobacco tin. On the 11th floor, Dinah's office looked like another economy entirely. Glass walls, steel shelves, conference table wide enough for 12 clients, city skyline reflected in the afternoon sun. She offered coffee, opened his file box, and started stacking documents into 3 piles: taxable income, depreciation schedule, and retained earnings. She had seen enough records by then to know Earl was not careful in the casual sense people used at coffee shops. He was systematic. She asked for the older ledgers from 1973 through 1979 because her junior associate had flagged a pattern that looked unusual. Annual machinery expense was low even when acreage rose. Cash reserves increased in years with mediocre yields. And there was only one short machinery note after his father's death, then none. Earl unwrapped the ledgers from waxed paper and set them on the table like church books. Dana read in silence for a while, then asked, "When did you begin 6-month input reserves?" Earl answered in 6 words, "After I watched one winter auction." What he meant was January 1974, Clay County Fairgrounds, -9 degrees, wind slicing through coat seams. Earl had gone to bid on a used disc and stood near a family he knew by first name. Their farm had not failed from laziness, and it had not failed from one dramatic mistake. It had failed from stacked obligations that did not bend when weather did. At auction, their 4020 sold for less than half of what they owed against it. Earl wrote down one figure that night and kept it for life. Forced sale price was usually 42 to 58% of financed value, and debt contracts always assumed full value. That spread could erase a decade of labor in one season. Dana asked him to reconstruct the years precisely, and he did. The sequence read like a metronome. 1973, 120 owned acres, 80 rented, corn yield 101 bushels per acre, wheat yield 37 bushels per acre, gross revenue $68,420, net after inputs and rent $21,630, cash saved $9,400. Machinery debt 0. 1974, added custom baling income, $4,980. Gross farm and side work, $77,110. Household spending, $13,880. Rebuilt transmission on older tractor for $1,240, parts and machining. End-of-year cash reserve, $18,760. 1975, bought 40-acre parcel from retiring neighbor at $590 per acre. Total $23,600, paid at closing. Legal and recording fees, $612. Reserve fell to $7,940. Then rebuilt to $15,300 by harvest. 1976. Signed planner note for $28,600 at 9.8%. Quarterly payment $4,121. Paid through stress year. Interest paid total $4,368. Sold package in 1977 for $24,200. Accepted loss as tuition. 1977. Replaced with older planner. $3,900 cash. Repairs $740. Gross revenue $82,540. Reserve rebuilt to $26,440 by December. 1978. Bought 2 gravity wagons and 1 auger at farm retirement sale, $2,180 combined. No debt. Household spending held at $14,210. 1979. Added 60 rented acres only after securing fertilizer and seed in cash. Ended year with $39,800 liquid, enough for spring inputs without borrowing. 1980. Declined Mercer package at 12.75%. Bought repossessed combine and repaired it for total $14,140. Harvest completed without machinery note. Dana tapped the ledger margin with her pen and said what few people said out loud in that decade. The discipline was not old-fashioned. It was mathematically modern. Every unpaid interest dollar became optionality in the next crisis year. Every avoided payment lowered fixed overhead. Every reserve month bought bargaining power when others were forced to sell. By late June 1985, that optionality became visible in the field, not just on paper. Earl's 1972 combine threw a feeder house bearing on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly when wheat moisture had finally fallen under threshold after a wet spell. A financed operation would have called the dealer truck, accepted emergency labor rates, and added another payable to a stretched month. Earl pulled the machine into the shade, split the assembly himself, and used a bearing kit he had purchased in winter for $196 and shelved in labeled bins beside spare belts and chains. He lost 9 working hours, not 9 days. He resumed cutting at dawn Wednesday with total repair cost under $300, including grease, seals, and 1 replacement sprocket tooth he had welded from stock steel. Across the county, custom crews were billing $42 per acre with fuel surcharge. Earl harvested his own acres and 2 neighbors' emergency acres for cost, plus parts, charging $19 per acre, because his machine was already paid for and his objective was throughput, not margin extraction. The same pattern governed his purchases. At a Salina estate auction that August, a dealer representative opened bidding on a 6-row cultivator at $6,000 by comparing it to $11,400 retail new. Earl waited while 2 bidders chased each other to $7,300, then turned to a less polished lot at the back fence. An older tine harrow, surface rust, 1 broken bracket, poor paint, no glamour. He bought it for $480, spent $164 on steel and bolts, and put it in service for fall seedbed prep. Cost difference versus the financed cultivator was $6,656 before interest. At 11% borrowing cost over 5 years, avoided expense was closer to $8,650. Numbers like that did not impress crowds. They built estates. His living pattern matched the machinery pattern. Annual household cost in 1985 came in at $15,240. Groceries, $5,020. Utilities, $1,910. Property tax and insurance, $3,140. Truck fuel and maintenance, $1,860. Clothing, $360. Medical, $1,770. Giving, $1,020. Miscellaneous, $160. He canned vegetables from a half-acre garden, repaired his own porch roof with reclaimed tin, and delayed repainting the farmhouse another year because paint did not increase yield. He was not performing poverty. He was refusing leakage. When Dana closed the file that evening in Wichita, she gave him a 1-page projection through 1990. It showed 3 scenarios: aggressive borrowing, moderate borrowing, and 0 long-term machinery debt, with staged land purchases only when cash exceeded 2 crop cycles of inputs. In the aggressive model, net worth reached $1.08 million with high volatility and foreclosure risk in a drought year. In the moderate model, $1.19 million with tighter cash swings. In Earl's actual pattern, assuming conservative prices and 1 bad weather year, projected net worth was $1.31 million to $1.38 million with substantial liquidity. The range sat on paper in black ink, plain as weather data. Earl folded the projection into his coat pocket, took the elevator down, and walked back to the metered curb and work boots that left dry field dust on downtown concrete. At the truck, he checked the wired tailgate, tapped it once to make sure the knot held, and started the engine on the second turn. He drove north out of Wichita as evening light flattened across the highway, carrying nothing that looked like wealth and nearly every habit that creates it. He crossed the county line just after dark, headlights shaking across wheat stubble and gravel dust, and by the time he turned into his own drive, the projection sheet from Dana Pike had a crease worn into it from his thumb. He parked the Chevrolet beside the machine shed, carried the paper inside, and set it on the kitchen table under the same yellow bulb his mother had used. Then he opened the seed corn box, pulled the carpenter pencil from behind his ear, and wrote one line above the next blank page. Keep 2 crop years ahead of fear. By the end of July 1985, he had closed on the Harlan Quarter, 70 acres at $624 per acre. Total purchase price, $43,680, with $3,980 in closing and filing costs already paid from cash. He put $2,140 into terrace repair and grassed waterways before fall rains. The land looked rough in places, but rough land bought right beats, polished land bought on terms that can turn against you. That autumn, he harvested wheat at 42 bushels per acre on his better ground and 35 on the new quarter, while he rebuilt fertility. Gross farm revenue for 1985 finished at $146,320. After inputs, rent, taxes, insurance, fuel, repairs, and household spending of $15,240, he retained $38,910. In January 1986, he made the least dramatic decision of his life and one of the most profitable. He did not expand rented acres despite pressure from 2 landlords who offered fast handshakes and verbal promises. Instead, he kept total farmed ground tight enough to plant and harvest with existing machinery, then set aside $24,000 as untouchable reserve and $12,000 as opportunistic auction capital. That year, corn averaged $1.94 per bushel in his contracts. Yields were adequate, margins thin. Because he had no long-term machinery payments, his break-even sat near $1.71 per bushel, while several peers carrying newer iron needed $2.18 to $2.31 before family living costs. He ended 1986 with owned acreage at 310 and liquid cash equivalents at $126,400. Before we go any further, if you want to know how the quiet numbers in this stretch turned into one of the most talked about auction moments in Reno County, hit subscribe and stay with this story, because the arithmetic only gets sharper from here. From 1987 through 1990, Earl's ledger read like controlled accumulation rather than expansion theater. 1987, bought 90 acres south of Norway Road for $710 per acre, $63,900 total, paid at closing, spent $4,260 on lime and drainage tile, harvested 118 bushels corn average across core tracts, year-end liquid reserve $143,770. 1988, drought pressure, cut county yields hard. His average dropped to 74 bushels on non-irrigated fields and 89 on better moisture-holding soils. No note renewals required. Sold old Gravity wagon pair for $1,200 and bought a used grain truck for $4,800 cash. Year-end reserve still $119,340 after all bills. 1989. Purchased 140-acre distressed parcel at $685 per acre. $95,900 total. Legal, survey, and back tax settlement. $6,240. Retained earnings after purchase. $51,600. No machinery debt, no operating debt. 1990. Acquired final tract in that cycle, 200 acres at $790 per acre, $158,000, paid in 2 certified checks from prior harvest cash and money market redemptions. By harvest 1990, he owned 740 acres clear. On paper, using conservative land valuation of $1,350 per acre average across mixed quality tracts, land assets stood near $999,000. Machinery, trucks, bins, and tools marked at fair used value added roughly $221,000. Stored grain and prepaid inputs, net of obligations, added $98,000. Liquid accounts sat around $87,000 after recent purchase. Total assets came in close to $1,405,000. Liabilities, including short-term payable, on fertilizer, invoiced after delivery timing, were about $65,000. Estimated net worth, roughly $1,340,000. A county that still called him Patchwork Earl had a millionaire in patched denim buying fan belts at the discount parts counter. He did not live like a millionaire because that was never the point. In 1990, his household ledger showed food, $5,480, utilities, $2,060, clothing, $390, medical, $1,940, truck fuel and maintenance, $2,140, property tax and home insurance, $3,420, giving $1,280. Miscellaneous, $610. Total household cost, $17,320. The old Chevrolet remained in service with 336,000 miles, rust deepened around the wheel wells, and a new used transmission installed for $640 plus his own labor. The visual story stayed the same. The balance sheet kept moving. Across the same seasons, Len Mercer kept running radio spots about productivity and tax advantages tied to financed upgrades. He was not a cartoon villain. He sold what the market rewarded him to sell. A high-horsepower package generated larger commission than a refurbished machine and kept floor inventory turning. His pitch to younger operators followed one script: scale now, refinance later, let inflation shrink the debt. For some years, that worked well enough to feel true. Tom Barlow believed that script because he wanted his sons to come home to a larger operation. Tom was a good operator, meticulous with planning windows, generous with neighbors in storms. In 1982, he refinanced and expanded to 480 leased acres with a $410,000 note tied to variable rates that moved from 11.9% to 17.6% as conditions tightened. Annual debt service climbed past $68,000, while corn prices and yields moved the wrong direction together. He sold cattle first, then 2 tractors, then still fell short. In 1986, he lost the lease blocks and watched equipment leave on auction trailers. He did not fail from laziness. He got trapped in timing and leverage. Denise Whitaker and her brother Cal were equally hardworking. They took over family ground with 320 acres and tried to modernize in one step, signing a combined equipment package of $286,000 at blended 13.4%, counting on 2 strong harvests to stabilize cash flow. Instead, they took a poor wheat year followed by drought stress. Their monthly obligations did not care that rain had missed their section lines. By late 1987, they negotiated extensions twice, paid penalties, and then forfeited 320 acres when collateral covenants tripped. Denise took bookkeeping work in town at night. Cal ran custom hauling in the winter. They carried no bitterness toward neighbors, only fatigue. Miguel Soto started with less and reached harder. He assembled 220 acres leased and owned mix, financed inputs and repairs through an operating structure that left him with $172,000 principal by spring 1988. 3 missed payments did not come from indulgence. They came from 2 low-yield cycles and basis penalties at delivery. When his bank called the line, he liquidated equipment under pressure and closed his independent operation. He kept farming in reduced form through custom labor and seasonal contracts, then later rebuilt slowly. Raylene Price came from cattle, not row crop focus, and her numbers broke on feed and interest. She had a herd expansion plan tied to favorable feeder prices, but feed cost inflation and 14.1% borrowing rates compressed margin until each month took cash instead of building any. She exited cattle after selling down at weak prices and spent 2 years doing relief milking and bookkeeping before stabilizing. By the first week of September 1988, the emotional weather around Concordia had changed from teasing to triage. Courthouse postings multiplied, auction bills stacked at feed stores. Men and women who had sponsored ball teams and church suppers were now explaining missed payments to people younger than their own children. Earl never treated their losses as proof of his superiority. He brought parts when asked, cut emergency acres for reduced rates, and kept his language plain. Keep your core paid for. Lower fixed cost first. Cash buys time. The hardest stress test came in spring 1989 when a late cold snap and stand damage forced replant decisions across both counties. Seed costs had risen, diesel had not softened, and many operators were already extending terms from the prior year. Earl's own engine trouble returned that April when a head gasket failure showed up 2 days into planting. He hauled the tractor into the shed, surfaced the head at a local shop for $180, replaced gasket and studs for $146, and lost one planting day because he had stocked parts over winter. His reserve fund covered replant seed and fertilizer without a bank call. By contrast, several neighbors needed emergency note increases at rates above 15% to finish planting at all. In 1990, another pressure wave arrived through land values. Appraised prices in pockets of Kansas softened while debt balances stayed full. That mismatch crushed equity for borrowers who had expanded near cycle highs. Earl used the same rule he had used since his 20s. Buy only when cash remained after purchase to cover 2 crop cycles of inputs and living costs. When he bought the 200-acre tract at $158,000, he still kept enough liquidity to operate without borrowing through a bad year. Debt-free did not mean risk-free. It meant risk could be absorbed without forfeiting control. Let me stop here and ask you something. When everybody around you says leverage is the only way to be taken seriously, would you accept slower growth to keep decision-making power in your own hands, or would you borrow for speed and trust the cycle to stay friendly? Put your answer in the comments because this is the fork that defined every family in this chapter of the county. By late November 1990, Dana Pike updated the file in Wichita and circled 2 figures in red. Debt service ratio near 0 for long-term obligations, and liquidity coverage comfortably above 6 months even after land purchases. She also flagged a strategic consequence Earl had not spoken aloud yet. With fixed costs low and assets increasing, he was no longer simply surviving volatility. He was acquiring optionality that could eventually be directed outward. Not charity as spectacle, but structured help that did not weaken the giver or infantilize the receiver. Earl read the memo, folded it into the seed corn box beside 48 months of ledgers, and went back to winter maintenance. Outside, the 1978 Chevrolet sat under a shed lean-to with frost on the hood and one mismatched door in primer gray. In town, people still noticed the patches first. The books kept telling the fuller truth. The next morning, frost still held to the north side of the shed when Earl opened the seed corn box again and placed Dana Pike's memo beside his winter parts list. He did not circle the red numbers she had marked. He copied them by hand into his own ledger, then wrote the only instruction he trusted: protect operating control first, then look for useful risk. Through January and February 1991, while others argued at coffee counters about whether land had one more drop left, Earl priced tile repairs, checked grain moisture in storage, and kept bidding discipline the same as before. If cash could not clear it, he did not raise his hand. By the third week of March 1991, Dana asked him to bring every deed copy and 7 years of tax schedules to Wichita for a full strategic review instead of the usual quarterly file pass. She had moved 2 junior associates off larger corporate clients that day and gave the Jennings file the conference table by the glass wall. That alone signaled what she was seeing. Earl arrived with the same coat, the same work boots, and a cardboard banker box tied with baling twine. A receptionist, who had never met him, asked whether he was a delivery driver. Dana answered from her office door without looking up from the ledger sheet. "He is the most liquid operator in this room." The receptionist apologized. Earl nodded once and set the box down. The numbers between 1991 and 1996 were not glamorous, but they were relentless. 1991. Bought no land, improved soil on existing tracts, spent $18,440 on lime and drainage, finished with $214,600 liquid, and 0 long-term machinery debt. 1992. Purchased 60 acres adjoining the Harlan Quarter at $910 per acre, $54,600 cash, plus $2,880 closing costs. Year-end liquidity, $236,300. 1993. Grain prices softened. He reduced discretionary capital expense to $6,200, retained $198,400 liquid after all inputs, living costs, and taxes. 1994, purchased 110 acres at probate sale, $1,020 per acre, $112,200 total, paid by certified check. Installed used pivot section for a high-stress parcel. Total installed cost $17,600, less than 1/3 of new. 1995. Average corn yield 127 bushels per acre on core ground. Wheat, 44. Gross farm revenue crossed $412,000. Household spending remained under $19,000. 1996. No expansion purchase. Retained earnings accelerated in a favorable price year. Liquid and near-liquid accounts reached $612,000. On a wet morning in April 1997, the private revelation happened in Dana's corner office with rain tracking down the glass in narrow lines. She laid out 20 years of returns, depreciation rolls, bank confirmations, and recorded deeds, then read totals the same way a surveyor reads boundary coordinates. Land at conservative market valuation, $3,640,000. Equipment and rolling stock at fair used valuation, $510,000. Grain inventory and prepaid inputs net of payables, $430,000. Cash and cash equivalents across money market and insured accounts, $240,000. Total assets, $4,820,000. Total liabilities, almost entirely short cycle payable, tied to seasonal input timing, $73,000. Net worth, after adjustment and reserve assumptions, $4,747,000. She turned the sheet toward him and added one more line in pen. Estimated annual free cash flow under conservative commodity pricing, $318,000 to $442,000. Earl studied the page, then looked out over downtown Wichita traffic far below, where everyone moved as if speed alone created margin. "That is more than safety," he said. Dana answered, "Yes, this is capacity." In the outer office, one associate asked another whether the numbers were correct because the client in question had arrived in patched overalls and parked an old truck with primer on one door. Dana heard it and replied through the open doorway, calm and direct. "Those overalls represent 26 years of avoided interest." The room went quiet, then went back to work with a different tone. If you are learning something from this chapter, press like and share it with one person who confuses big payments with real progress, because this section is where quiet discipline turns into community leverage. Earl did not announce a foundation. He did not hold a dinner. In June 1997, he and Dana drafted a private note structure called the Working Ground Pool and seeded it with $300,000 from post-tax retained earnings. Terms were strict and plain: 0 interest, 5-year amortization, annual principal due after harvest, crop flex clause allowing 1 deferred installment in documented disaster years, mandatory crop insurance, and 1 non-financial covenant requiring each borrower to mentor a younger producer for at least 2 seasons. Collateral was real but proportional. Second lien on equipment, or first lien on specific parcels only when needed. No balloon language, no teaser rates, no penalty traps. Tom Barlow was the first recipient, though he resisted accepting it. He had lost the 480 leased acres years earlier, then kept a small rented block and a reputation for honest repair work. Earl offered $62,000 from the pool to convert Tom's side work into a formal repair cooperative with 2 service bays, 1 used service truck, and startup inventory of bearings, chains, and hydraulic hose. Principal schedule, $12,400 per year for 5 years. Tom paid late once, by 21 days after a storm season, delayed receivables. Earl accepted the delay under the contract terms and charged no fee. By the end of year 5, Tom had repaid the full $62,000 and hired 2 younger mechanics, one of them Miguel Soto's nephew. Denise Whitaker and Cal Whitaker came next in 1998 with a narrower request and a clearer limit than their earlier expansion years. They needed $94,000 to secure a stable 160-acre lease block, purchase a used planter and drill package, and establish a 12-month input reserve so they would not reopen a revolving operating trap. Earl approved $94,000 at 0 interest with annual principal of $18,800. Dana insisted on 1 additional covenant: no equipment purchase above $25,000 without written reserve coverage. Denise agreed immediately. Cal took a week, then agreed. They repaid on schedule through 2003, 1 year ahead of term, and never carried another equipment note after that package. Miguel Soto approached the pool in 1999 with smaller numbers and the strongest caution. He asked for $38,000 to buy 40 acres that bordered his rented ground, plus $9,000 for a reliable used truck so he could run a winter school route and stabilize family cash flow outside harvest. Total note, $47,000. Annual principal, $9,400 for 5 years. He completed payments in 2004, then came back not for money, but to report that the school route income had covered medical and insurance variants during 2 weak price seasons. The land stayed in his name. Control stayed local. Raylene Price's case carried the heaviest emotional weight because cattle losses had drained both capital and confidence. In February 2000, she sat at Earl's kitchen table with 6 pages of handwritten projections and asked for enough to launch a seed cleaning and conditioning operation that could service small producers ignored by larger processors. Equipment, leasehold improvements, and working capital totaled $85,000. Earl funded the full amount through the pool under 6-year principal terms at $14,166.67 per year, 0 interest, with a 2-quarter grace period for installation and customer acquisition. Raylene made the first payment in month 11, then paid ahead in years 3 and 4, and closed the note in year 6, exactly as projected. Her business reached positive annual net in year 2 and remained cash flow positive thereafter. By the end of 2004, the initial $300,000 pool had recycled principal repayments into new notes while maintaining a protected floor balance of $120,000 for contingencies. Total notes issued from 1997 through 2004, $611,000 across 11 borrowers. Delinquency over 30 days, 1.8% of scheduled principal. Charge-offs, 0. Mentorship covenant compliance, 11 of 11. The arithmetic mattered because generosity without structure can fail both giver and receiver. Earl built structure first. 3 days passed before Dana called with the file that tied private generosity to public proof. She had completed a comparative model of Earl's no-debt machinery approach versus a typical financed replacement cycle from 1980 through 2007. In the financed model, replacing major equipment every 6 to 8 years with average blended interest of 9.9% to 12.4%, would have consumed approximately $2,360,000 in principal and interest over that span, excluding emergency repairs and downtime financing. In Earl's paid-for and rebuild model, total machinery purchase and major repair outlay for the same operational scale was $1,040,000. Estimated avoided cash burn, $1,320,000. If invested at conservative blended return of 4.2% in short-duration instruments during holding periods, the avoided cost capital effect rose above $1,900,000. That gap became note pool fuel. Then 2008 arrived with credit tightening that moved faster than the weather. On a cold October day at a Reno County land auction, 3 younger operators stood on the edge of losing 640 acres because their bank pulled seasonal credit 48 hours before closing. Len Mercer was there, still polished, still urgent, offering emergency financing packages with variable rates, penalty clauses, and cross-default language broad enough to capture unrelated equipment if one payment slipped. The crowd heard the old confidence in his tone. They also heard fear in the younger farmer's replies. Earl asked the clerk for 10 minutes, walked outside, made 2 phone calls, and returned with a certified check for $1,260,000. He bought the tract outright, then in front of the same crowd offered split resale contracts to the three operators. Each would take 213.33 acres under separate deeds, zero interest over 20 years, annual principal only, mandatory crop insurance, conservation covenants on erosion-prone sections, and automatic mediation before any enforcement action. Len challenged the check, questioned whether it was theater, and asked for bank verification on speaker. The clerk made the call. The bank officer confirmed available liquidity under Earl's control at $8,400,000 and no machinery debt on record. No one clapped. Rural crowds rarely do. They just stopped looking at Earl's clothes and started looking at terms. 2 weeks later, back in Wichita, Dana appended one more page to the Jennings file and titled it Community Optionality Ledger. It listed principal deployed, principal returned, acres stabilized, and default prevention value calculated against foreclosure, comparables from the county recorder's office. From 1997 through that 2008 auction, direct zero-interest principal commitments reached $1,871,000. Principal repaid or contractually secured stood at $1,546,000. Acres directly stabilized through notes and resale structures totaled 1,436. Estimated foreclosure losses avoided using recent forced sale discounts and legal cost averages exceeded $2,900,000. Earl read the page, closed the file, and asked only one question. Can the terms survive me? Dana said yes, if governance was written now and audited quarterly. Earl nodded, took his copy, and drove north in the old truck while evening settled over the highway, and the wired tailgate rattled exactly as it always had. At dawn the next day, Earl parked the Chevrolet beside the machine shed and carried Dana's draft governance notes into the kitchen without unfolding his coat. He called Wichita before breakfast, asked Dana to prepare trust language that could outlive personal memory, and gave her 3 non-negotiable rules: principal preservation, zero-interest lending only, and borrower mentorship written as contract covenant rather than moral suggestion. By the first week of November 2008, Dana had assembled a governance binder thick enough to hold an entire decade of decisions. Trustee succession, quarterly audit procedures, delinquency mediation standards, and annual county transparency letters that listed dollars deployed, dollars returned, acres stabilized, and defaults avoided. Earl signed in blue ink, then placed a duplicate set in the seed corn box under the ledgers. He did not call it legacy. He called it maintenance. By spring 2009, the 3 operators from the Reno County auction were no longer spoken of as a rescue story. They were spoken of as a test case that held. Wade Kellerman took the north parcel, 213.33 acres with lighter soils and higher wind exposure. His annual principal was set at $26,666.25, due after harvest, with no interest and mandatory crop insurance. He paid in full every year except 2012, when drought triggered the crop flex clause and pushed one installment to the next season. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked for the contract. By 2026, he had reduced principal to $346,661.25, held full compliance on conservation covenants, and mentored 2 beginning operators through their first machinery budgets. Lena Crowell took the middle parcel, same acreage, stronger moisture profile, similar principal terms. She and her husband kept family living under $41,000 annually for 8 straight years, bought used equipment in cash lots under $18,000, and built a reserve fund that reached $212,000 by 2019. She paid principal early in 4 seasons, then paused early pay acceleration in 2021 to help her mentee acquire a used grain cart without debt. By the start of 2026, her remaining principal stood at $293,328.75. She still mailed paper ledgers with her compliance packet, and Dana still filed them by hand before scanning. Corey Duvall took the south parcel and nearly lost momentum in year 3 when hail tore through 2 sections in June. Insurance covered enough to operate, but not enough to absorb household and machinery strain at once. The contract mediation clause activated exactly as written. Dana chaired the review, Earl attended without speaking, and repayment shifted to a 2-year catch-up schedule, with no fees and no interest add-on. Corey recovered, resumed full installments, and by 2026 had completed 9 mentorship years for younger producers, 3 more than required. The structure did what structure is supposed to do. It prevented panic decisions. Tom Barlow's repair cooperative became the quiet hinge in that entire ecosystem. What began as a $62,000 note for 2 service bays had grown by 2016 into Barlow Field Service, a 4-bay shop with mobile units that covered Cloud, Republic, and northern Reno routes in planting and harvest windows. Gross annual service revenue passed $780,000 in 2022, with net margins between 11% and 14%, depending on parts volatility. Tom carried no long-term debt after year 6. He set apprentice wages above county average, insisted on cash discounts for parts bought in bulk, and taught every apprentice the same line Earl once wrote in carpenter pencil: "Fixed cost will outrun pride if you let it." Tom did not become rich by dealership standards. He became solvent by every measure that protects a family. That mattered more. Denise Whitaker and Cal Whitaker repaid their $94,000 note 1 year early, then stayed deliberately small. By the second week of October 2011, they had signed a long-term lease renewal for 160 acres with fixed escalators capped below prevailing county increases, and they built their machinery plan around one rule: no payment that survives a bad yield year. Denise handled books with near-clinical discipline. Cal handled field timing, and neither apologized anymore for older paint. In 2026, they remained debt-free on equipment, carried only seasonal payable, cleared by post-harvest settlement, and had a combined liquidity cushion of $189,400. They still sent a holiday card to Dinah each December with one sentence on the back: "Terms saved us." Miguel Soto finished his $47,000 note in 2004, bought no additional land until his reserve hit 12 months of inputs, and kept driving the winter school route that stabilized his household through weak commodity years. In 2015, he bought an additional 18 acres for $54,000 cash, adjacent to his original 40, and leased row crop rights on a crop share agreement that protected downside. By 2026, he owned 58 acres free and clear, held a paid-for home in town, and had trained his nephew, Daniel Soto, the same nephew Tom hired, to read operating budgets before reading equipment brochures. Miguel's phrase for that lesson was simple: math first, paint later. Raylene Price turned the $85,000 seed cleaning note into Prairie Kernel Conditioning, one of the few regional services willing to run small lots without punishing minimums. She repaid in 6 years as projected, then expanded in 2011 with retained earnings rather than outside debt, adding color sorting and bagging capacity that doubled throughput during peak windows. Her company posted positive net income in all but 1 year, and that year she still preserved payroll by cutting owner draw to 0. In 2026, Prairie Colonel employed 9 full-time staff and seasonal crews with annual revenue near $1.3 million and no long-term liabilities. She chaired mentorship sessions for first-generation operators and refused speaking fees. "Keep it useful," she said. The multiplier effect showed up best when Dana ran aggregate numbers for the Jennings Working Ground Trust after formal conversion in 2013. Initial private pool seed had been $300,000. Earl endowed the trust with $3,500,000 in phased transfers from 2013 through 2018, all post-tax, all documented in quarterly reports. From 1997 through 2026, total zero-interest principal deployed reached $9,840,000 across 47 notes and 6 structured land resales. Repayment rate by principal dollars was 96.4%, with mediated restructures covering nearly all variants. Charge-offs totaled $182,400 across 29 years, less than 1.9% of deployed principal. Acres directly stabilized or transferred under low fixed cost terms, 3,412. Estimated foreclosure losses avoided using county forced sale discount bands and legal cost averages passed $16,100,000. One disciplined balance sheet had become county-level shock absorption. Len Mercer's resolution came without spectacle, which suited the story better than any public reversal would have. After the 2008 auction, he continued operating Mercer Ag Systems through a deteriorating inventory cycle. Floor plan interest rose, used inventory sat longer, and margin compression widened as producers delayed upgrades. Len had built his business in an era when credit velocity looked like strength. In the next era, carrying costs punished that exact model. By 2012, he sold the dealership group to a regional chain at a figure lower than analysts had predicted 5 years earlier, then accepted a consulting role that lasted 18 months before retirement. He did not disappear. In 2015, Cloud County Extension hosted a panel on machinery strategy after another period of commodity stress. Len took the third seat after a lender and before a cooperative manager and spoke for 14 minutes with none of his old urgency language. He said financed image had misled him, that he had treated monthly payments as normal weather when they were actually fixed obligations in a variable world, and that paid-for equipment with lower overhead had outlasted many polished plans. He named no villains, blamed no farmers, and did not ask for forgiveness. He simply stated what he had learned. Earl attended in the back row, cap in hand, and left before the coffee line formed. By 2026, every named life in this county chapter had an addressable outcome. Dana Pike remained in the same glass-walled corner office in Wichita, now both accountant and designated executor for Earl's estate documents, and she issued quarterly trust transparency reports to recipients and county partners, exactly as governance required. Evan Rusk, once the loan officer who slid forms across the desk before hearing the request, eventually became senior credit manager at Prairie State Ag Credit and revised internal stress testing to include low-debt operating models after 2014. He later said that Earl's file forced his department to relearn what liquidity actually looks like in work clothes. Earl was 74. The 1978 Chevrolet had been retired to light duty after 2014 when frame rust passed practical road safety. He bought a 1994 Ford F-250 with cash from a local estate sale and drove it the same way he drove everything else, long past fashion and deep into function. By autumn 2026, the Ford showed 402,000 miles, a cracked dash, worn bench seat, and a toolbox latch held by baling wire. He still wore repaired denim. He still kept household spending low enough that most people would not believe it without ledger lines. He held land and cash-equivalent assets around $18,700,000, with no operating debt and no personal debt. The old 1972 Combine sat cleaned and housed, retired with dignity after decades of service. The newer used Combine that replaced it had also been paid in full. Tom Barlow was solvent and mentoring apprentices. Denise and Cal Whitaker were stable on 160 acres with no equipment notes. Miguel Soto owned his acres and kept the winter route by choice. Raylene Price ran a profitable seed cleaning business and trained new operators every year. Wade Kellerman, Lena Crowell, and Corey Duvall continued paying principal and mentoring the next line exactly as contract required. Dana kept the reports honest. Len Mercer told the truth about what changed. No one had to pretend the hard years had not happened. They were written into the terms. If you want more stories where arithmetic, not image, decides the ending, subscribe now and stay with this channel. If this one stayed with you, comment with one fixed cost you would cut first to protect your own operating control in a bad year. Share this with the person in your life who confuses borrowed shine for real security because they may only need one clear set of numbers to see the difference. Earl closed the seed corn box that evening, turned off the kitchen light, and at first light drove the old Ford past fields he owned clear. Fields his neighbors now held on terms they could survive, and a county that had finally learned to read beyond patches. The next Tuesday, Earl drove the 1994 Ford to the Cloud County Extension Hall before sunrise, parked beside 3 newer pickups with polished hoods, and carried a brown accordion folder under his arm. The winter air cut sharp through the lot, and his coat still showed the feed sack lining at the cuff, where the seam had been restitched twice. Inside, Dana Pike had already set up at the long table with printed quarterly trust packets, each one stapled with principal schedules, delinquency notes, and acreage compliance maps. By 9 o'clock, every borrower with an active note had checked in, signed the attendance sheet, and taken a seat. Wade Kellerman sat with a yellow legal pad open to his field plan. Lena Crowell had 2 binders tabbed by year, one for production and one for mentoring logs. Corey Duvall arrived last, still pulling gloves off as he walked in, and handed Dana a cashier check before he sat down. Tom Barlow leaned against the back wall with grease still under his fingernails from a morning service call. Denise and Cal Whitaker sat shoulder to shoulder, quiet as always, each with 1 page of numbers and no extra talk. Miguel Soto brought Daniel Soto, now 30, who carried the compliance folder and listened more than he spoke. Raylene Price took a side chair near the outlet and set down a laptop and 3 handwritten backup ledgers. Dana stood, read the packet totals in her measured voice, and made the room hold still around arithmetic. Principal deployed year-to-date, $428,000. Principal returned year-to-date, $391,600. Active delinquency over 30 days, 0. Conservation covenant compliance, 100%. Trust liquidity after reserve requirement, $4,982,000. She turned 1 page and continued. From inception through this quarter, acres stabilized remained 3,412. Estimated foreclosure loss avoided remains above $16,100,000 using county forced sale discount tables and legal cost averages. Mentorship covenants, completed or active, remain at full compliance. Then she sat down and called borrowers one by one, not for ceremony, but for accountability in public hearing. Wade stepped forward first and spoke in 10 plain sentences. He had paid $26,666.25 again on schedule, carried one deferred installment only in the documented drought year, and mentored 2 operators who now controlled 280 leased acres with no machinery notes. "They still ask about paint," he said. "I tell them to ask about overhead." Earl nodded once. Lena followed with her packet and pointed to a reserve line. She had crossed $300,000 liquid in late 2026 after pausing early principal acceleration for 2 seasons to help her mentee with storage upgrades. She resumed acceleration this quarter and sent an extra $12,000. Dana recorded it, then asked whether the mentorship term had closed. Lena answered, "No, I extended it by choice." No one in the room looked surprised. Corey set his check on the table and exhaled before he spoke. "This closes the catch-up schedule and puts me current to original track." Dana verified the amount, stamped the receipt, and slid him a copy. He did not smile broadly. He just sat down lighter than he had walked in. Tom did not present a trust payment because his note had been closed for years, but he reported apprenticeship outcomes under covenant legacy terms he had adopted voluntarily. 4 apprentices had completed training. 2 opened mobile repair routes with no startup debt. 1 joined Raylene's operation as maintenance lead, and 1, Daniel Soto, had become shop manager. Tom read the wage sheet out loud and said he still kept 1 line from Earl, posted above the parts counter, lower fixed costs first. Denise and Cal reported next. They had renewed their 160-acre lease under capped escalators, pre-bought fertilizer with cash discount, and cleared seasonal payable by December again. Denise read the household ledger line because new borrowers always asked whether tight living was performative. "It is not performance," she said. "It is margin." Cal added 1 sentence. "We sleep." Miguel pushed Daniel forward for the mentorship report. Daniel described 2 young tenants he was coaching through first-year budgets, 1 line item at a time. He held up a color printout with 3 columns: financed upgrade path, used cash path, and hybrid path with reserve constraints. "We run stress at low yield first," he said. "Then we decide." Earl watched from the end of the table with his hands folded over the old accordion folder and said nothing. Raylene closed the borrower reports with operating numbers from Prairie Kernel Conditioning. Revenue had reached $1,360,000 last year. Net margin was 9.8% after labor increases, and she had set aside $70,000 for a revolving micro-grant fund for small lot seed cleaning applicants who failed conventional underwriting. Dana asked whether it would stay grant only. Raylene answered, "Half grant, half zero-interest service credit, tied to record-keeping classes." Earl finally spoke. "Make them teach 1 more person." Raylene smiled once. "Already in the form." By mid-afternoon, the room had moved from testimony to decisions. The trust approved 2 new notes, both capped, both collateralized proportionally, both requiring mentorship and insurance. No applause, just signatures, witness lines, and stamp dates. When the meeting broke, Len Mercer was standing in the hallway near the county fair photo display, hat in both hands, shoulders narrower than Earl remembered from the equipment lot years. He had been invited by extension, not by Earl, to lead a spring workshop on machinery cost stress. He waited until the room thinned, then stepped toward Earl and Dana. "I brought something," Len said, and handed over a laminated copy of the 1980 Combine brochure. Same model line, same payment table. $96,400 at 12.75%, $1,420 monthly, 10-year term. He tapped the print with 1 finger. "I taught a whole generation to chase this line first. Payment before resilience. Dana looked at him for a beat, then asked what he tells them now. Len answered without hedging. I show full life cycle cost, including bad years. I show forced sale, discount risk. I tell them a paid-for machine at lower capacity can outperform a finance machine at higher capacity if fixed obligations are wrong for the cycle. He turned to Earl. I was wrong about what survives. Earl accepted the laminated sheet, slid it into the accordion folder, and said 4 words. You said it publicly. Len nodded. I did. That was the end of it. 3 days later, Dana drove to the farm for the annual physical records audit and executor inventory as trust governance required. The kitchen smelled like coffee and cold iron from the mudroom heater. Earl set the seed corn box on the table under the yellow bulb and opened it. They removed each item and checked it against the archival list. The 1990 projection sheet with 3 scenario models, the memo with red circled liquidity notes, the signed 2008 governance duplicate, the first working ground pool term sheet, and the original quarterly transparency template in Dana's handwriting. Dana scanned each with a portable unit and placed acid-free copies in labeled sleeves. Originals went back into the box. Digital files synced to trust storage before she left the driveway. They closed the remaining physical threads that afternoon. The 1978 Chevrolet, frame soft and road retired, had already been transferred by bill of sale to the Concordia Vocational Agriculture Program as a training chassis. Its wired tailgate, preserved exactly as it had rattled through town for decades, now hung on the shop wall beside a placard listing mileage at retirement. The mismatched primer gray door was still on it. The 1972 Combine had been serviced, test run, and documented for annual field day demonstration. It started on the 3rd crank and cut 1 ceremonial pass each September to teach maintenance over replacement. The Carpenter pencil from Earl's first post-1973 ledger page sat in a glass tube at the trust office, not as decoration, but as a tool log artifact tagged with one caption: Keep 2 crop years ahead of fear. By the first week of April 2027, planning prep had started. Earl stood at the shed door while Daniel and 2 younger operators loaded seed and checked monitor calibrations on paid-for equipment with chipped paint and clean service logs. Tom's service truck rolled in for a hydraulic hose and rolled out 10 minutes later. Lena stopped by with her mentee to pick up conservation maps. Corey dropped off signed insurance declarations. Denise and Cal sent updated cash flow sheets to Dana before noon. Miguel texted Daniel a revised fuel budget for the week. Raylene delivered treated seed lots and refused a rush surcharge because the order had been planned correctly. At sunset, Dana sent the quarterly letter to every recipient, lender liaison, and county partner on the list, including Evan Rusk at Prairie State Ag Credit. Subject line: Transparency Report, Jennings Working Ground Trust, Quarter 1. Attachments: Principal Ledger, Compliance Log, Reserve Statement, Mentorship Roster. Evan replied in 14 minutes. Received, reviewed, no discrepancies. Earl shut the shed doors, set the seed corn box back in its place, and turned the kitchen light off with the same motion he had used for years. At first light, he drove the old Ford down the lane, patched knees bent at the clutch, coffee cooling in a metal thermos, and past fields held by people who could survive a bad year because someone had taught them to count before they borrowed. The county had once laughed at the patches. The county now copied the math